a double-meaning title, sassy Ellie, some oddly specific hypotheticals of infected, and our clicky friends. This episode's got it all. Today I'm back to recap episode 2 of The Last of Us and talk about all these smaller things you might have missed, game parallels, changes from the original story, and everything in between. There are no game or future spoilers in this one, so if this is your first foray into The Last of Us, you are in safe territory. We open with another entirely new scene for the show, as we jump back in time to 2003. In The Last of Us Companion podcast, Craig talks about how these sorts of cold openings are drawing on Gilligan's approach with things like Breaking Bad. There, he often leveraged those first 5 to 6 minutes of the episode where the audience is the most curious and receptive. And so, we are dropped right into the thick of it. We follow Ibu Ratna, and yes, I most likely butchered the pronunciation, but there it is. But she is a professor of mycology at the University of Indonesia. This immediately tells us that 1, what we're about to see is global, and 2, this is someone with a sense of authority when it comes to the infection, which we of course know to be fungus-based. And that is exactly what we see here. She is brought to see a human patient, but immediately we learn that since they have a bite mark, clearly they are not patient 0. On top of that, there is a number of people missing, and the people who they could try to trace back are nowhere to be found. In other words, some kind of miracle mutation has happened with this fungi that was never meant to survive in human hosts, and now it is out there in the wild with absolutely no traceable cause. Also, note the mention of the flour and grain factory here. It's an almost throwaway line, but it means that the now contaminated flour and whatever type of grain they produce, one of the most common pantry staples, is being shipped all across both the country as well as the wider world through exports. If you've been delving down the Last of Us rabbit hole already, you'll already know of the flour theory stemming from episode 1, which this episode certainly fuels. The gist of it is that, in the premiere, everything just so happened to line up that neither Sarah nor Joel ever consume anything with flour, which would likely be contaminated. Sarah had no flour to make pancakes, so they had eggs. Joel says he's on the Atkins diet, a diet that avoids flour-based carbs. Neither Sarah nor Joel took the cookies offered to them by the neighbors. Sarah doesn't eat any of the cookies they bake as they have raisins in them. And lastly, Joel just so happens to forget to buy the birthday cake. So, coincidentally, they managed to avoid any flour for the entire day. There's also a ridiculous amount of real-life lore mixed in here as well. The mill in question just so happens to be the world's largest milling factory and is of heavy importance in the Greater Asia region. Then, there's the reports of Indonesians switching from eating rice 3 times per day to bread or noodles and so on. And to top it all off, in the episode 1 companion podcast, it is coincidentally mentioned that there are a ton of breadcrumbs for people to pick up on. So yeah, I think that all but confirms it. Which brings us on to the final scenes where Ibu says, "Bum." Like I mentioned a second ago, because she is in clear authority here, this is effectively her saying, "We've lost. This is a fungus that transcends anything we know, and it is already too late." And narratively, that scene of Ibu just asking whether she can go home and spend the rest of her day with her family, I think also ties in with the clear split between Tess and Joel we see later in the episode, though more on that in a second. Also, as we see later in the episode, this sort of extreme reaction was not exclusive to Indonesia, but of course, neither here nor there, it didn't really achieve anything. And like I mentioned, most of this is a departure from the game. There, the transmission happened through inhalation of spores and bites. This sort of flour spread never really happens as far as we know anyway. And ditto for the international aspect. It is safe to assume that it was global, but in the game, we are firmly planted in the shoes of Joel and never leave the US. After the opening credits, we open with Ellie, which of course gives us our first interpretation of the title, Infected, as both Joel and Tess question her about the bite. Also, note the sharp juxtaposition here of Ellie calmly sleeping in the fetal position basked in this warm light, that is then promptly contrasted by Joel and Tess on the highest of alerts. This is another departure from the game, as there we see the trio pull an all-nighter and just keep on going. In the companion podcast, Craig says that this decision was made mostly because of the live-action format more than anything else. Because the game is obviously being played, it just didn't make sense for the player to have a stopping point there, and so the story just kept on moving forward. In the show, on the other hand, they opted to have this slight time skip that already begins to hint toward the fact that Ellie is in fact immune, as despite the entire night passing, she is still perfectly fine. Similarly, this also begins to draw clear lines between Joel and Tess in how they see the world. Tess begins to ask, but what if? What if she is immune? While Joel shuts it down immediately, saying they've heard this little fairy tale a million times already. This aspect of Joel being overly cynical and denying the evidence that is even right in front of him would be a through line in this episode, so we'll be returning to this particular conversation a whole bunch later on. Another thing to note here is how Tess explicitly says that they are not good people. This will probably rustle some feathers, but one thing that I think the series always did very, very right is portraying Joel as a good father, but not a good man. So I think this is just some neat foreshadowing toward the things we'd see later on. I won't get into it too much to avoid spoilers, but just like we see here, Joel is selfish. Right now, Ellie is just cargo, and if she becomes too much trouble, well, then they'll just leave her behind, just like cargo. Though on a lighter note, I think this is a brilliant added scene that really allowed Ramsey and Pedro to start growing into Joel and Ellie. Scenes like,
if she so much as twitches, don't.
Or the excellent lines of,
Jesus, fine, I'll sandwich at them.
Do a great job of building that dynamic duo vibe between them that we see in the game during the off periods where you just scavenge around and stuff. I mentioned last time how I think this is something that the series must get right, as the game has a lot of these moments where Joel and Ellie simply talk about stuff while you walk around as the player and just explore. So I think we can 100% expect more of these added scenes just to make up for that discrepancy. Following this, we see them enter the city where, just like we heard with Ibu, we see the bomb spots and how they clearly tried to contain the fungus. In the game, this was more so on the outskirts of the city, but the whole bombing angle is consistent between the two versions. Another cheeky addition here is the conversation Ellie has about how she got bit. You might have noticed that in episode 1, Ellie mentioned someone named Riley, and now when she's talking about how she got her bite, she seems to be holding back something when she talks about sneaking into the mall alone. So who is this Riley? Why did Ellie get separated from her when she was taken by Marlene? How is it that Ellie could sneak around on her own like that? Only time will tell, I suppose. She also asks about all kinds of different infected she's heard about. She first describes a big shambling super infected that apparently blows up, which Joel and Tess just write off as fantasy. But she also asks about ones like bats, to which they respond by remaining quiet. This is of course in reference to the clickers, which instead of seeing with their eyes, let out a clicking noise and sense their surroundings through the sound waves. Ellie referencing bats here is of course because that's exactly how bats see as well. They produce echolocation by emitting high-frequency sound pulses and listening to the echo, thereby sensing their surroundings. They then make it to the hotel where we learn that Ellie never learned to swim. Will Joel be the one to teach her? Will they live out their days surfing in Hawaii? Will the swimming be relevant? Who knows? Another thing to note here is what Ellie does and does not know. Remember that she has been born into the apocalypse, so what she knows of things like hotels and things like that comes entirely from books. Unfortunately for Joel, Ellie is a very curious person, so her endless barrage of questions won't be ending anytime soon. As we see them climb up and through the building, Ellie remains positive, saying that it wasn't that bad, but Tess then responds,
try climbing 10 floors with our knees, see how you feel.
In an interview with Polygon, Craig talks about how Joel in the show is meant to be portrayed as a little more realistic than in the games. In the game, crouching is simply just a stealth mechanic. But in the world that the show is painting, Joel is a 55-year-old man. He can't keep crouching for minutes at a time, and he doesn't have some massive quads, right? I wonder how this will play into the more action-centric sequences from the games, and whether Joel's weathered body becomes a more explicit element of the story later on as well. We then get a brief conversation between Joel and Ellie, where we get some good old Ellie sass.
Where'd you learn to do that?
The circus.
But what's more interesting is the history between Joel and Tess that is implied here. When Ellie asks whether they're a thing, Joel says that he'll pass on that question. Though in episode 1, we clearly saw them sleep together, and clearly saw how they've known each other for what seems to be a very, very long time. So what exactly is their relationship, and will we ever learn of how they met? Another interesting debate we see here is Ellie asking whether it's hard killing the infected, knowing that they were people once. This is a huge cliche in zombie and infected stories, but it's important to note that in the world of The Last of Us, because this is a fungus taking over the body, the infected are all still technically alive. The fungus never kills them, unlike, for example, The Walking Dead, where they are indeed just the dead walking. So, is this morality debate going to come up sometime again? And similarly, Ellie also asks about the guy that held them up before. Only, they're cut off by Tess and they just keep on going. Judging by what we know of Joel, clearly that shouldn't have been the first person he's killed, but the memories of Sarah clearly made it a lot more personal. So, how is he dealing with it? Is Ellie just a painful reminder of what happened back in 2003? Will Joel tell her about Sarah? Another major add-in for the show we see here is that the fungus creates a network through which it can alert other infected connected to it. In the game, such connections do not exist, but Neil Druckmann says it would have made for some really interesting gameplay. Another important thing to note here is the nature of Ellie's immunity. From what it seems like so far, she is immune to the fungus as a whole, so her getting bitten seems to have no effects. However, the infected are still attracted to her, so if they do get caught up in a swarm, she is in as much danger as anyone. This just sets in stone the fact that Ellie's immunity doesn't mean anything if they're caught up in a tight spot. And we're not going to be getting any epic scenes of her walking among the infected as if nothing happens. The world is dangerous, and at best, Ellie just holds the key to the infection, but nothing more. They then find their way into the museum where Ellie spots a weird-looking infected, asking what could have done something like that. Tess and Joel talk about how they haven't heard it. Again, this is just subtly planting that seed of sound being an important aspect for this type of infected, and whatever it happens to be, clearly neither Joel or Tess want to go up against it. This is also an interesting example of the showrunners writing the show for two different audiences, as people familiar with the game are more than aware of what this is referring to, and this is more so building up hype. While for first-time viewers, these are more so important context clues more than anything else. Though the presence and existence of clickers is also handled a little differently in the game. There, I think it's another case of the player just having to be introduced to a game mechanic, so it's a mechanical necessity more than anything else. Whereas in the show, in-universe, they are meant to be relatively rare, and because of how dangerous they also have this air of taboo around them. Some of that is of course just dramatization, but I also like that they are treated as these little mystical beings. And speaking of which...
What is that mysterious ticking noise?
Well, that clicking noise is exactly what Ellie was referring to. A special kind of infected that let out a clicking noise through which they sense their surroundings. First off, in the game, the revolver is one of Joel's first weapons, so I love its appearance in the show as well. Also, we actually already saw a clicker in the first episode in the very final scene. And thirdly, in production, this was one of those scenes that actually had to be reshot. Craig talks about how people on the team who hadn't played the game thought that the sound aspect of the clickers just seemed odd. So the writers added in the seal of Joel explaining that they need to stay quiet and that they can't see with their eyes. In the game, I think the biggest difference with the clickers is that, just like I mentioned a second ago, they are treated as a harder game mechanic that you need to be introduced to. So there are a whole bunch more of them, and you have to fight more of them as well. They are equally terrifying though. Another important distinction here is that the show chooses to focus on the infected. So after they get away from the clickers, it's more so a fear of attracting more infected and just getting away as soon as possible. In the game, on the other hand, while the infected are clearly always a threat, it is FEDRA that poses the biggest threat. Craig talks about how an important question for the writers here was, why would FEDRA even be here? The QZ was meant to keep the bad guys out, and that is it. They police the buffer zone to stop the bad guys from moving freely between the QZ and the outside. But why would they bother hunting down random people just heading out? From a gameplay perspective, it just meant more variety in the enemy types. But for the show, it just made more sense for going FEDRA here and simply focusing on the danger of the infected. Which brings us on to Ellie's second bite. This is another departure from the game, as there the confirmation that she is in fact immune comes from her being able to freely breathe in the spores. But since those are not a thing in the show, it's the second bite that confirms for the audience that yes, she is in fact fine. Another thing to note here is Tess getting angry with Joel for being so incredibly cynical to the point that he denies the reality in front of him of Ellie still being fine. This is of course hinting toward her also being bit, so she just can't help but lash out at Joel for rejecting any bit of hope and happiness he can. She knows she's going to die. She's already feeling it. So to her, Joel denying the miracle that is Ellie is just anger-inducing more than anything else. Also note how from this point on, she is suddenly in a major rush and tries to stick ahead of them as much as possible, clearly fearing that her time is running out and that she might attack them. Game-wise, much of this is adapted extremely faithfully. The whole rooftop sequence happens in both, and the whole bringing wood planks around is a game mechanic we all know and love. When they arrive at the Firefly base, everyone is already dead though. Again, in the game, they are fearing FEDRA coming after them, while in the game, they have touched the just introduced fungal network. Like the rooftop scene and nearly every other Joel interaction thus far, here too he denies all hope and simply says that it's over and they are going home. Despite seeing Ellie live through 2 bites now, something that no one has ever done in the 20 plus years of the apocalypse, he denies any and all hope. This prompts Tess to get angry again, which is when Ellie realizes that she got bit. Which neatly gives us our second meaning of the title, as we now learn that it is not Ellie who is infected, it is in fact Tess. And note the brilliant scenes we get of Joel here. First off, notice the flinch as she steps toward him. Like I mentioned at the top of the episode, Joel is not a hero, so seeing this fear in him I think is a brilliant humanizing addition. And note how as soon as he learns of her bites, his hand is planted firmly on the gun. He is a survivor first and foremost. That doesn't mean he won't move heaven and earth for people he loves, but he is not some legend who's never scared and is never vulnerable. This is how they have survived this long. And explicitly showing that moment of vulnerability and weakness brilliantly sets us up for the rest of Joel's story in my opinion. And the last scenes we get in this one is Tess saying,
Say who you can say.
Which I think is the perfect capstone of this episode. Much of it was about Joel denying hope, denying happiness, even denying the reality right in front of him. But with these simple words, it's like a wake-up call to him that Ellie is different. There is something here. Something worth fighting for, something worth protecting. Another thing to note here is that Ellie does indeed protest them just leaving her behind. Not to get into spoilery detail, but we will learn why is it that she seems so overtly aggressive yet now tries holding on to someone she knows will die. So, what's with the sudden attachment? What will the bond between her and Joel look like, or already looks like? And the final scene is just straight up gross, but we see the infected make it inside, and yeah. Again, in the game, this is FEDRA, so she is simply shot, and that is the end of that. Craig talks about how the scene of Tess's death was supposed to be disgusting in that clearly these spores are taking over her, but it's also beautiful in how it's shot and how connected this whole web is. It's scary because these are monsters, but also oddly peaceful as she just stands there flicking the lighter. And the last thing to mention here is the name drop of Bill and Frank. The setup here is already looking to be different to the games, so we are all kind of going in kinda sorta blind, and I for one am really looking forward to it. Though in short, that is episode 2. To me, if I was cautiously optimistic after seeing the first episode, this one certainly sold me on the series being done justice. The horror of the clickers was 100% there, the dynamic between Joel and Ellie is already shaping up to be just as endearing as the game, and the add-ins we've gotten in the show thus far have also been excellent. I mean, the fact that the flower theory exists at all, I think speaks to how intricately the story is crafted. Anyway, all that said, I hope to see you back for episode 3, and all the hidden details we'll no doubt have there. And that's the video. Yep, it's confirmed at this point. I'll be talking about The Last of Us every week because it is just too good. I am considering changing up the format of the series and moving it to my second channel because right now, it literally isn't possible for me to put this out weekly, I'm gonna be honest. Only time will tell, I suppose, but if you are interested in more of The Last of Us, subscribe to this channel, I don't know, follow my Twitter, and potentially my second channel, we'll see what happens. But with that said, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my rambling, so seriously, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye!